Thank you so much, Srikanth, for, may I call you Srikanth?
Yeah, absolutely, please.
Srikanth, to just introduce you a little bit to our viewers, this is Srikanth Suvvaru I'm in conversation with. He's the VP NatWest Group, is it now? After rebranding of RBS, and he's a talent attraction manager with the company. How many years has it been with this group, Srikanth?
Ooh, it'll be 5 in January, so about 4.5 years.
Right, right. And you've always been in the D&I space?
No, D&I is actually very new to me. So I think it started about 3 years ago. I've always been involved in conversations and talking about stuff, but my first real foray into I was with LGBTQ inclusion, and that was my first step in, and this is late 2017, and it was my first time actually getting into the space, talking to people, educating myself, trying to figure out what everything was, because we've got to face it, right? Like, everybody's woefully ignorant if you don't have a lived experience of it. So that was about 3 years old, 3 years change.
Right. So because we were talking about work a few minutes ago, so we were all, the way we work, the metrics and the, processes have all changed. We couldn't imagine that, all of us it will equalize basically everyone, whether you're the CEO, whether you're a working mother, whether you're, in any middle rung employee, it's all the same for us. We're all sort of making use of technology. But interestingly, as we keep asking of everyone we interview, just to understand how this works and to understand what changes like. So we know how this works, but sort of take us through the changes of work has also changed, especially in the D&I space, because I would think that to have a working internet connection, and when you take away the physical space, when you take away the physical distance of hiring, right from hiring to selecting the right candidate for your organization, to also spotting talent, there are many steps right involved. But now with literally everybody is on a screen and everybody has access, and you have access to pretty much everybody.
Yeah.
So that physical element of approachability, of stumbling upon the right opportunity, of getting connected with the right people, that's gone. I'm not saying it's gone, but there's also the aspect of online work. And so there's so much more, so many people can offer with a direct access to the people who matter.
Yeah.
So has work also in this D&I space also allowed you to broaden how you look at talent, to broaden how you look at candidates, and maybe look for new skills, maybe look for skills that you hadn't thought would need readaptation, and thereby sort of broadening the space to hire inclusively?
Right. So this is a bit of a double-edged sword, especially because the going online and digitalization of everything also coincided with companies kind of locking down, right? So not a lot of people are hiring out there. People have reduced. I'm not going to say stopped, but a lot of people have reduced. Some companies we know have started letting go of people. So while yes, it has proved a great equalizer and everybody is on the same platform and everything else, and it definitely allows us to expand our footprint, right? Typically, if you're an organization and you had locations in, say, Bangalore and Delhi, you would hire in Bangalore and Delhi, right? Now with sweeping decisions about real estate or whatever, what have you, you could sit in Kolkata, you could sit in Kashmir, you could sit anywhere, and it doesn't really matter as long as you can get the work done, right? Now, it has widened the scope and reach of where we can our hiring, right? The talent pool just opens up so that you're not location constrained anymore. But unfortunately, it also hit at a time when incomes are not what they are, revenues are not what they are. Companies have started looking at cost savings. A lot of organizations focus on reskilling of employees and not really going out and hiring new people. So you don't want to make somebody redundant if you can avoid it, right? And you would rather have them reskilled for another role. So there's a lot of different moving pieces to this. But some of the things that were challenges go away, right? So for example, especially in, say, the people with disability space, right?
Right.
Companies that didn't have the physical infrastructure now don't have an excuse of, oh, the office space isn't friendly, I can't make changes to the space because I rent the building, etc., etc. Now that is no longer something that you have as, a reason, right? However, that also does mean that you have to provide the technological back end in order for people, screen readers and other accessibility tools. But there's certain things that go away, there's certain things that come in. It's all kind of up in the air. Yes, the pool is widened. Some of the challenges go away. Some new challenges appear.
Yes, you were saying that all the factors that companies have to keep in mind.
Yeah, so the challenge between wanting to hire new people on having access to new talent pools, vis-a-vis what you actually provide for them within the organization, is something that you need to look at any which ways, right? So for example, what was the growth path and your career progression that you provided to people from certain backgrounds, right? Whether it's people with disabilities or people from the LGBTQ community. Did you have career opportunities within your organization already? Right? So it's all well and good to go out and hire new people and bring them into the organization. But if you didn't set them up for success right from the get-go, then how much progress are you really making? So yes, some companies are positively reacting to it. However, I don't think that this is the answer and the godsend that everybody thinks it is in terms of access, right? Problems that existed before still exist right now if you haven't dealt with those issues prior. So yeah, it is, everything has two sides to the...
Right. So for a company like NatWest, how many employees would you have?
I'm not 100% sure that that is information that we can actually talk about.
Right. So for example, when you're talking about also how employees are treated, and keeping in mind the various factors that sometimes doesn't even factor into D&I. When we talk about diversity, we sort of think of a gender block, or we think of mostly women, right? Hiring women is equal to diversity for many organizations, and we don't even get started on inclusion. So if you remember we were talking about this a few days ago, also when we were talking about this conversation, that there's this case in Cisco of caste discrimination, and Cisco is being sued for it. Of course, the case is in America, where caste doesn't figure in one of the rights that can be violated, but Indian organizations are keenly aware that caste is a very, very, when I say organizations in India, this is the reality, and it's very hard to blindside that. It's hard not to acknowledge that. But when you actually see cases like this, writers have written about it. People who've worked in the IT space or worked in this space and moved on have spoken about it. But till there is a very, very prominent and very, very publicized case, it's often sort of the blind spot for many organizations. So in general terms, take me through, how do you feel that, do you think this is sort of a corporate blind spot that no one wants to acknowledge? And what do you think what do you think is the cause for it? Because it's amazing that in 2020, nobody wants to include, caste as one of the key metrics of discrimination, and key metrics that needs to be, broadly written into the D&I template.
So you would think that it is a very obvious thing that people need to be aware of, but the amount of rejection of the need. I mean, I think everybody understands that it is a factor. People believe it's not a factor where they work, right? And this is something that I've heard in D&I circles itself, where people are like, what do you mean? How can corporates be, how can they discriminate on caste? We're meritocracy. We hire people based on testing and, completely blind, factors. But that is not the case, right? One thing that most companies are, and this is such a corporate term, but you are risk averse, right? And talking about caste is a very risky space, right? It is fraught with sensitivities. It is fraught with, you can't ask somebody. That's a violation of personal
The
identity.
self-declaration, right?
Uh, but once you have that information and people do self-declare, what do you do with it, right? There's not a lot of conversation that's happening right now. There's very little recognition of the fact that it is a problem. People understand that it is somewhere, but within corporate spaces, to understand that, can we look at our employee population and see what percentage of inclusion is it representative of the population outside, in the real world. Things like that, I don't think they currently exist. I could be unaware, but I don't know of any organizations that actively pursue inclusion in caste.
Right. The very fact that there is no template, the very fact that, say, if this sort of a problem comes in front of you, you would not know precedence. You would not know what really, what is the way to respond. And the Cisco response was from what, this is purely off what I read in, media reports, was purely that the HR, because it didn't have a response, hence it went to court. And hence it, a response that also not just seeks to resolve, but also actively address, what is happening and address employee dissatisfaction or an employee discrimination, just as they would address any other form of discrimination at the workplace. And the fact that there is no precedent, that fact that there's no response to this is an enormous gap.
Yeah. So people tend to think of HR as the people with all the answers, or they're supposed to have all the answers, right? But unfortunately, HR is filled with people who are just people, right?
Exactly.
If you've come up in a system and an organization that has never talked about, recognized, or acknowledged caste as a problem, why would you think of solutions for that space, right? So and I can bring this back to the LGBTQ space as well. A few years ago when we first started and we were talking to different organizations about what does POSH mean, what does prevention of sexual harassment mean in same-sex harassment cases, right? And people were like, what, and we were looking at the rules and the guidelines, and we said we have to treat it like any other case. The investigation, the response, the way the panel is kind of set up would obviously have to be a little different. It's not about gender, but it is about LGBTQ. So we figured it out as we went. Right now, a lot of companies have templates that have been luckily the D&I space in India is very democratic in that people are very giving of their policies and everything else, right? So if somebody figures it out, they're like, here, take it, please run with it. And now a lot of companies have, all-inclusive, gender impartial, sexual orientation impartial, prevention of sexual harassment, right? But now if a caste case comes in front of you, and again, you've never had to deal with it, or you've dealt with it, but you didn't know what, right? Like in the Cisco case, if you didn't know what to do, then you look out and you ask for help and nobody else has done it either. And then what do you do, right? I think education and sensitization of HR is just as required as it is for the larger employee.
Right. HR learning is such a big, need, because what it basically means is that HR, we are looking at in isolation, but as you rightly said, that HR is also made of people, and people bring in their, ingrained biases and biases they grew up with, all at every level of school, college, and, when they apply for work. And it's almost fantastical to sort of expect that all of that will evaporate once they start work, and they automatically, magically start seeing their colleagues as, without those lens, which is why there has been also sea change in the way conversations happen at workspace. So, for example, the jokes and the casual sexism that was quite commonplace even a few years ago, thanks to a lot of push, and thanks to a lot of empowering campaigns, and even like trainings and workshops and sensitization, those have changed, right? So have you been witness to some of these change, and how can HR like be a part of that?
So yeah, I mean, absolutely. When we started our LGBTQ journey, a few years ago, awareness was not. I mean, people hadn't. Again, this goes back to what I was saying a little earlier. If you'd never met an LGBTQ person or a person who was out or self-declared, then you would think it's okay and normal to crack jokes, or how the media portrays or used to portray LGBTQ people, right? They were camp, they were over the top, over sexualized, and we started talking. So something that we did within then RBS, now NatWest group, is we ran Mythbuster sessions that kind of tried to debunk, and that was the first thing we did, right? Debunk myths about people in the LGBTQ space, right? And those were safe space conversations where we said, you know what, it's okay, tell us what is your perception, right? And then we went into different facets of it, different aspects of it. And this, right from the top down, was a very welcome thing, because most of the people in those rooms weren't biased against the community. They just had no clue about the community. They had never met with, interacted with someone, and hence they took portrayals that they saw on TV or in movies or whatever it was. And once we actually started talking to them about people, and we said, they're people, just like you and me. And,
but that it has to be said
it
to
does.
people.
It does.
Just really quite alarming that it has to be told people, adults in a workspace especially. So is that something you've come across quite often, that it's not like a malicious bias, but it's just like ignorance, but that doesn't excuse any of it. But
it doesn't excuse it. But again, this is the lived experience of the people that we're talking about. And unfortunately, you still have to tell men to be respectful to women. That is not something that you need to be. So,
that's a given, right? But it's not, clearly.
Apparently, I need to tell you not to sexually harass someone or tell them that they look sexy or whatever it is. And what are you doing?
Right.
This is something that we need to say in this day and age, right? There was a colleague a little while ago, a very nice, gentlemanly person who was very respectful, and he was talking to another colleague, and he was like, "Oh, you'd look better with," and I was like, "No."
Yeah.
Right? And he was like, "Oh, is that wrong?" And I was like, he's like, "I wasn't meaning it." I was like, "No, I know, but no, that's not your opinion to give." And he's like, "Oh, sorry." But it's just that people, do need to be told, right? If you don't, the affinity bias, and this is something that goes back to the caste thing. If you think the people like you are the only kind of people out there, and you've never met a person from a different background, a different upbringing, a different sexual orientation, a different culture, a different space, then it's a clash of cultures meeting. Yes, we're both Indian and we're both living in the same city. That has no bearing on the fact that when we meet, we might not know how to talk to each other, right? You might hold biases about me, thinking that, oh, this person only likes ABC, and I will have a certain number of preconceptions about you. So education is honestly the only way to go about it. And in the caste space, I myself don't know that much about it. I've been very fortunate that I know some people who've pointed me in the right direction. I've gone away, tried to do some homework, educated myself on the studies, the research that's out there. Still nowhere scratching the surface, right? But there are people out there who've been doing this for decades. And I'm looking at their work and their hard work and their research and their studies, and I'm trying to educate myself about that right now. And I'm not an unaware person, but I had never been told about caste before. I never knew what mine was, right? Until I actually started talking about the space. And then I started recognizing, this is a Brahmin thing. This is a Dalit thing. This is a, Savarna thing. And, I have no idea what these terms meant right?
But also not being aware of caste is also a privilege. Don't you
Yeah,
think so?
yeah, oh,
Not
absolutely.
encountering one's own caste in manifesting in little things that sort of dehumanize you in everyday life is also a privilege. It's an enormous privilege. And like you said rightly, that acknowledgement is the first step. So in talking about in the corporate space, and because you have vast experience, you're an expert in this, and you you are someone who actually can start the conversation on this. So for example, what are the when it comes down to the basic metric of respect for people, right, and tackling bias. So is there sort of a format? So this thing has worked. The DNI template for has worked for a certain group of people, certain community, certain section, gender, sexuality. Could it be possible for, there's a two-part question, could it be possible to replicate some of the best practices into, drawing like a overall structure? Second is, which is I think the more important, is having people in from the community in decision making positions, in important roles inside offices, inside corporate structure, where they um, are gatekeepers, not gatekeepers, but where they with their lived experience can sort of guide the change. So for example, you and I do not qualify to sort of even have that conversation or even make any policy decisions on that conversation, right? So just as we are looking for diversity hires, just as is the way forward then that companies make absolutely like structured call out for work for communities. They make sure that the people they hire are specifically for a certain number of percentage of positions in a company in a role, like certain number of roles have to be filled by you know certain communities or caste groups. And from these hires, from the people they hire, make sure that their growth is equitable, and they eventually grow in the company to positions where they get to set the policy for a lot of other people. And so that this is addressed by somebody with a lived experience.
So the only part of what you said that I will challenge is that I'm not an expert in any shape, way, or form. I'm just somebody who's, trying to figure it out as I go
Right,
along.
as many other organizations.
Yeah. And so there are two things, right? One is, yeah, we are absolutely nobody to kind of, I don't have the answers to any of the questions that you just said, right? However, there are some things that are no-brainers, right? One is you need to start a conversation of acknowledgement first and foremost,
Right.
right? A little while ago, people were like, there are no gay people in corporate spaces. What are you talking about? LGBTQ, ha ha ha, that's funny. And you're like, no, there are. They just don't feel safe to come out and tell us who they are or their truth. And the acknowledgement of the reality of the world in which we live needs to happen first and foremost, right? You need to have conversations. You need to talk about how do you, if somebody comes and tells you that they're from a certain caste or whatever, how do you respond? How do you speak to them with respect? Respect is something that's non-negotiable, right? Within our organization, we weren't. The one thing that I loved about the way RBS NatWest Group kind of dealt with this was we were unapologetic about it. There was no let's talk about LGBTQ if you're comfortable. It is, we're talking about this because you need to know how to speak to people with respect. Respect is non-negotiable. However you feel at home, that's your business. But within these four walls, or at that time the four walls, but within the office environment or within work time, when you talk to somebody, you talk to them with respect. You treat a person with respect, irrespective, woman, old, age, background, language, it doesn't matter. And the fact that somebody was from a certain space did not allow you to kind of say whatever you wanted to, right? So respect is non-negotiable across the board, whether we're talking about religious sentiments, whether we're talking about caste, no matter what. So that is principle number one. And if you have that sorted, if that is your fundamental principle, then you're that's a good start, right? Number two, acknowledgement, beginning conversations and starting to realize, first admitting there's a problem, post which you can even then start thinking about solutions, right? The fact that you need to say, not is caste a problem in corporates? Yes, it is. There's research out there. Go out and read about it. Absolutely. But how can we address it? How can we address it respectfully? What do we do? What can you do even as a first step to make a safe space so somebody feels safe coming forward and telling you that they're from a certain background, right? How do we start these dialogues? What are the different challenges? Hiring is a later thing, right? Hiring is a step 2, step 3 kind of a place. But starting conversations, how do you allow people to feel safe to have these conversations at the workplace? What are your policies, and do they discriminate in any way, shape, or form, right? A funny anecdote is, we were talking about inclusive policies at work, and we said we need to, all gender inclusive and all sexual orientation inclusive. And this gentleman came back a day later. He's like, done. And I was like, what? How? And he's like, yeah, I just did a control replace he, and I made it a he, he/she. And I was like, yeah, dude, that's not what it means.
Not what it is.
So actually, and see, simple things like family, the way we define family, and it's a set definition that most organizations make, is husband, wife, child, parent, right? And then our question was, who are we to define who your family is, right? Anybody you feel is important in your life is family for you. Right. So we changed that clause in all of our writing, right?
That's family. Because the real immediate manifestation of this I can see is trans people will define family in a very different way.
Yeah, partners. Same-sex partners, however you want to do it, right? Even if, did I lose you again? Sorry, you froze.
No,
I have you. Yeah. So so the definition of family is something that is super important. And that as a policy, and that applies across the board, right? So there's a re-examination of your policies to see what are inclusive and what are not, right? Hiring practices, that's something that we touched upon a couple of people talking. The fact that you hire based on a certain set of best practice decisions, right? Now, these best practice decisions are based on your current employee set. You believe these are the people I've hired, these are the people who have performed the best for me, and hence I should replicate this model over and over, right? Now, is that set really the most inclusive set of people that you're looking at? Probably not, right? IBM did this thing where they were talking about AI and bias, artificial intelligence, and how it's the answer to biases. And the funny thing was, the guy was like, people look at technology to be human error-free, but sorry, can you hear me? Is it better?
It is a little bit of lag, but go on, because there's definitely network issue. Yes, continue.
Issues, yeah. Yeah, so they were talking about AI being the solution to all human-based problems, right? They're like, but where are the data sets for the machines coming from? Machine learning is based on data sets, right? And they were like, humans are building those data sets, right? And the fact that if you believe that your top performers came from XYZ school and had ABC traits, that's bias going into the system at the very start. Obviously the machine will just replicate that and say, okay, so this was best performance and hence I will replicate this in my solution. So there are a lot of things that we need to re-examine from the ground up in terms of how we hire, what are the different things we look for, what are your inherent biases when you're hiring people, because there is a certain affinity bias when you're trying to hire. You will hire somebody like yourself, right? And that's a given, right?
So how do you, so for example, if we were to talk about NatWest, and how would you then, what are some of the good practices generally in the Rainbow Initiative, is it, you call it?
The Rainbow Network, yeah.
The Rainbow Network. So basically in the overall structure of, diversity and inclusion, and especially in your role of talent acquisition, how do you sort of measure this D&I? What are the metrics that you see that you need to follow to have a certain diversity, have a certain inclusion metrics in your company? And what are some of the good practices that you have, sort of seen and followed, and some are in the policy making right now, I'm sure.
So, and I'm going to go a little broader than just NatWest Group, but some of the things that I've seen in the industry over the past year or two, right, is the fact that Rise, the first LGBTQ hiring event, happened last year, and we were there. And one of the beautiful things that happened was that there was a recognition that companies were openly coming out to hire. Right, there were about 40 or 50 companies there. They placed a whole bunch of people, including with us. Some in our internship program. There was a recognition that was a talent pool that had been untapped up until this moment. When a company and organization is outspoken in its inclusivity, something that happens is that people come to recognize that if you are not afraid to speak up, then that means that you as an organization will potentially take care of them, right? And it has to be sustained. It can't be a, hey, look at us on Pride Day where, we're flying the flag, but it's sustained, right? And people recognize that. So we had a lot of people come up to us during these hiring events and say, in my previous organization, somebody was harassing me, or they said something that was, untoward and something homophobic or something. Is yours safe, right? And one of the things I said was, listen, I'm not going to give it to you in writing that we are, and 100% of people will welcome everybody with open arms. But if anything happens, we will definitely step up, right? And we did. There was a case where this person heard derogatory comments and, people were making slurs or whatever it was. Instantly, management down. We decided that, this is untenable, and the entire office had got sensitization training in that space, and it was a person who reached out and said this to me in a one-on-one, and they were like, well, I'm uncomfortable, I want to leave, but I'm not really sure. And I said, just give us a little bit of time to see what we can do, right? And we sensitized that entire office. We had VPs and senior managers stand up and be outspoken allies, right? Where they said, anybody can come and speak to me about this in your free time or otherwise or whatever, right? And that kind of reaction, this person came back at a later point and said, my God, that I didn't expect that. I expected maybe a move or something, but it depends on how you do it. I'm not saying that any place can be perfect, right? You will always have people coming in, you'll have people leaving, but how an organization responds to a right, is
a crisis.
Yeah, it's just is important. And
but it's also so sad that from the example that you gave, the default their default reaction was expectation was nothing will be done.
Yeah. Well, the default expectation, and this is a reflection of the history of the
right how organizations are generally.
Yeah, and have typically behaved in the past. Now, in this day and age, I know a lot of wonderful people in the D&I space who passionately believe in equity and respect, right? And they are making sea changes in their organizations, and I believe that this is something that's a positive move. However, this traditionally hasn't been the way people have reacted, right? So you don't blame somebody. You don't expect the best case scenario when something bad happens, right? You're like, okay, I'm going to move, and that's what we're going to do. On our website, for example, there's a story of a colleague, and she came to us a couple of years ago, and she's like, I'm transgender and I want to transition. And the way anybody from the community typically did it was they left, they transitioned in private, and then they moved somewhere else with a new identity, and they took up a job. And she said, that's what I'm doing. I'm just letting you know, FYI. And we said, no, I mean, not no, but give us some time. And she's with us today, and she's transitioned, and there's a blog on our website where she talks about her experiences in our,
she's an out trans person.
Yes, absolutely. And she represents her at a bunch of places, and she's proud because she's like, I did not believe there's a certain expectation that there's going to be loss of pay, loss of work experience. All this is a given. When I told her you don't need to do that, she was like, really, and I was like, give it a chance. If it's not working, then you can leave 6 months later, any which ways. But she's still there, and she's proud, and she speaks to the work that we do. Right? She herself is
Right.
somebody who's passionate about the space, and so I think organizations are learning, they're evolving, they're moving. Perhaps not fast enough. Some people are, and some people aren't. Uh, but there's a lot of things that require examination when you first embark on this journey. It's like you said, it's conversations, it's spaces, it's people. People obviously are the biggest part, and that's something that'll never change, right?
So, right, absolutely. So this is, it's beautiful that, when you talk about a trans person who thought and, who probably gave her trust to the company and knew that the company will do right by her. But nobody is aware of this more than you, that there is a, vast section of, queer people from the queer community, no matter how they identify as their gender. There are non-binary people, there are trans men, trans women, and a lot of them don't have the space or sort of also the background. We were talking about corporate meritocracy, right? Um, and how also often how you're judged on language, your speaking skills, and all of this come into play when you talk about inclusion, and how your team responds to people who come in with maybe not your sort of polish or sophistication or English speaking ability. So how do you think this plays out? Because this there is such a thing called corporate meritocracy.
Yeah, there is. Some things that we take for granted that we don't even think about twice, and I definitely never did until I had to look at, kind of breaking it down and kind of examining it, was that the corporate world is a bubble. Those big metal glass buildings where people just enter, and you have cappuccino machines and pay lunch and gyms and all that. That's a world that a lot of the population has just never seen, right? Especially if you don't come from the typical backgrounds that we're talking about, and if you work in a small or medium enterprise, if you're from a rural area, these are not things that we take for granted. Aren't something that, and it's very intimidating, right? Not just for LGBTQ people, but anybody, right? Anybody who comes from never having seen that before, it's kind of like entering an alien spaceship, like what is happening here? There's certain things that we take for granted. There are etiquettes that we follow that we again assume that everybody just knows, right? And we ran this, so we had this internship last year called Transcend, which looked to provide an internship for people from the transgender community who did not necessarily have typical access to the corporate space, because of whatever their backgrounds, right? And the point was give somebody access to RBS who would not typically have access to it, right? Somebody who maybe doesn't have a master's and 6 years work experience in another global bank or whatever it is. And in setting that entire thing up, the team and I looked at all the different pieces that we consider to be, just staples of the corporate hiring experience.
Right.
Do you need a master's degree in order to work at a corporate space, or is it enough if you showcase the skills that you have, right? If you can problem solve. When you're doing background checks and verifications, are those practices sensitive to the needs of the LGBTQ community? You can't out a person while you're doing a background check on them. That's just not done. When people come in, are they ready to, again, like I said, the overwhelming nature of just coming in and being inducted into an organization that is a big global corporate. How do we smooth that transition in? There are certain computer and program skills like Microsoft Office that we are like, yeah, we've been using it since we were 10 or whatever it is. No, no, people don't typically, or not necessarily. I'm not saying this is everybody, but there's a population that we're looking at. English, written and spoken communication. How do we help? And these are not short journeys, right? These are not something that you can do in an internship and get the person to where they need to be, but we needed to start somewhere, right? And rather than doing the typical induction, we did our general induction, but then we also went away and spoke to L&D and created bespoke trainings for these areas, right? Confidence. Uh,
which
if you
is
walk,
a big thing,
you,
and
if you walk into a boardroom for the first time, would you be able to say anything? Would you? I don't say anything sometimes if I don't think I know what I'm
right,
talking about.
correct. At any point in your life, it's just basically you
Yeah,
freeze.
yeah, and you know, because you're sitting in a group of people that you've never really hung out with before or worked with before, uh, you within yourself you wonder whether they accept you or what have you and whatnot, right? So some of the things that we did was, other than looking at our hiring and onboarding practices and everything else, we sensitized the receiving teams, right? We sensitized the receiving managers. We ran local language sensitization and mythbusters for security, infrastructure, housekeeping staff, right? Uh, in Kannada, Tamil, Hindi, whatever. Uh, there was still a case where the first day an intern came in, somebody at the kitchen staff pointed and laughed and this and that, and they came to me and they were like, that happened. And again, I was like, I'm so sorry. Right away, called the facilities manager, made sure that we put that entire team through a session, and they were like, it shouldn't have happened in the first place. But again, it was one of those things where not everything's in your control, right? So obviously everything didn't go perfectly, and we had a lot of learning that came out of the first batch of interns that came in. But we'll take all the learnings and go away and get better at it, and then the next batch will hopefully be received a little better, and so on and so forth.
Right, and also it's the intent has to be there. I understand, but where the intent leads to is also very important, because are you doing this because this is one of the check marks that you have to do at the end of the year? You have to show that these are the initiatives you've taken, or is there sustainability? Is there good intent to take it forward? Is there any actual intent to create permanent spaces, or is it just a diversity quota? So all of these are questions that I suppose a lot of organizations struggle to
Yeah, they do.
answer.
You know, something that I heard a little while back was somebody said to me, sorry, oh, you diversity and inclusion people, always crusading, always this, always that. And I was like, tough, like, I'm sorry you think it's too much, but tough. We're talking basically about respect now. Sure, it's coming. There's a lot of new information we're throwing your way, and I'm not saying it's easy to digest everything, but it should have happened organically, and we're fixing the fact that it didn't. Now, the other aspect of this is there are some organizations where I've also heard people say, I don't care. I don't care whether it's a woman, a gay man, I don't care who's doing that work. I'm sending my input into a black box. I need an output, right? Now, what's in that black box? I don't really care, right? And there are organizations like that, right? Who are so focused on a certain aspect of it that all this is just noise for them, right? But that's when the whole business case of white diverse teams are better delivery than others, and all that kind of comes in. And so one example that I keep using, I was like, if you wanted to design a financial service or product for pregnant women, you wouldn't put 9 men into a room to do it. That's just stupidity. If somebody's going in there and being like, oh, in the third trimester, this is what they'll need, and you're like, that's ridiculous, right? The best product that you can put out there would be to have women, as a part and integral to that creation of that thing. So I was like,
representation, basically.
Yeah, not just that. Whoever you want to create for has to create what it is that you want to put out there. If you only want to serve single men, fantastic. Run your organization however you want to run. But if you want your customer set to be larger, it just doesn't make sense, because you will not create a good product if it's not with an inclusive team. So there are different arguments that you can use to counter different challenges. But yeah, it does need a basic examination of who you are as an organization and what you hold important.
It's very interesting that you said this, that there are some organizations which just say that okay, we go by talent and we go by merit, and we don't, we are not discriminating because we are not seeing gender at all. But it's one thing to say that we are gender neutral, and it's another thing to say that we recognize gender, and there is a difference in it. That you can't, when you're talking about equity, for example, you can't say, for example, even the community, even the gender group of women, even the gender group of women. So you can't say that, you can't have men and women start at, at one point and then say that now we don't care about gender. For us, men are equal to women and we see both, equally. And because that's not right, because you have a historical, you have a past, and you have a history of discrimination, and you have a history of inequitability.
Yeah.
How do you set that right? So what you said, I find very interesting, that there are organizations which do say that we don't discriminate because we don't see gender. We don't discriminate on basis of this and this and this. Perhaps they have their own reasoning behind it, and they have their own processes of work behind it. But for example, to make a workplace equitable, have a certain quota of, say, women in the workforce, to make a workplace attractive to certain groups, that why, if they hear about your company, they know the narrative, and they know that, this is a company I want to work for, because it already has a reputation and established set of rules. What are the three things that are key to, build that kind of narrative around a diverse and inclusive workplace?
I think it's primarily around, it's not about seeing gender or seeing this or seeing that. It's about seeing need. If you truly are an organization that serves everybody irrespective of their background, orientation, whatever, do you see the difference in need? Or do you believe everybody's needs are identical as well, right?
Right.
So when we're looking, and this is what I meant a little earlier, you can say we treat everybody the same, right? But treating everybody the same means that you let everybody do the same kind of job in the most effective way possible, right? So that means that if it's a person with a disability and they have accessibility requirements, that you give them the accessibility requirements, and then that puts them on a level playing field with everybody else. If it's women who have childcare responsibilities and needs at home, it's about addressing that and looking at different timings. And there are different things that you do at different places where you provide access, you provide adjustments in order to put everybody on the same level playing field. And then you can say, I don't see, now everybody deliver exactly what I'm saying. That's fantastic. That is an organization that gets it. But you can't just say, I don't see it, hence these are the 5 things that I'm going to give you, and then everybody make do with those 5 things. That doesn't work, right? Those 5 things will work for exactly the same kind of people who, you already had, right? If you don't want, and if that's good for you, then I guess that's good for you. But we know in this day and age that is not going to cut it, right? The principal recognition of the fact that you will treat all your employees with respect, you will treat everybody equitably, and you will give them the same working experience is fundamental to any diversity and inclusion narrative, right? I'm also not a huge fan of bandwagoning. Don't show up on inclusion pride days and then just never do anything for the rest of the year. When an announcement is made or when something is trending, don't just say we stand with whoever. Don't do that. If you support, like I've heard this too, and the Black Lives Matter movement, which is the most recent issue, and a lot of companies here were like, Black Lives Matter, and I was like, wait a minute, of course we respect the struggle of the Black Lives movement, but what about religious intolerance and caste violence and gender-based sexual violence and all these things? What about them?
would you put yourself out there in the same space and say Dalit lives matter? Would
Yeah.
you?
And I was like, if you're not doing that, you shouldn't do this. That is massively hypocritical. Like, what are you doing? And that is the thing. Either you stand for what you stand for, or you don't. And consumers, employees, they're smart. They see through the hypocrisy of these, one stand statements and, changing the logo on a day or whatever it is. Companies that truly mean it and live it, truly mean it and live it. I do believe that we're in a space right now where religion, caste, these are things that need to be discussed, need to be acknowledged, need to be talked about. People are scared. There's sensitivities. I understand. It is very uncomfortable because people don't know how to tackle it, right?
Right.
But people didn't know how to tackle sexuality and gender orientation until we actually, sexual orientation and gender identity until we started talking about sexual orientation and gender identity. One beautiful thing that one of our transgender interns told us was, she came in one day and she was like, this is really weird for me. And I was like, what's weird for you? And she was like, I was talking about, my friends who were gay or in drag and this and that, and people didn't bat an eyelid. And I was like, so isn't that a good thing? And she's like, no, I've never, it's so weird that people are not being weirded out. And I'm like, well, that's where we want to get to, right? And that's where we want to be. So it is important that we normalize conversations, and the only way you do that is by having conversations. Start talking about caste, start talking about religious intolerance, start talking about all these different things, and that's the only way to do it.
Right.
Okay.
That's a great point. But just adding a perspective to that, normalizing conversation around a certain, say, group echo chamber also doesn't help unless you actually put your money where your mouth is and hire from diverse communities, hire from people with diverse backgrounds, because you can do all the normalization you want, but it'll be the same kind of people speaking to the same kind of people. So people who are actually invested in this with their lives, they're the ones who should actually, be around when you're normalizing conversations.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And the thing is, we have some amazing senior managers at NatWest Group where we have them coming to us and saying, I'm setting up a new team. This does not require anything to do with, it's a purely transactional, blah, 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 blah. So anybody who fits this bill, whatever community and background, and, please, I want to fill my team with, people from, a certain background or underprivileged spaces. And there are people who come to us and actively are pushing this, they're like, I want my team to be that way. And when somebody hears that, something happened in their team, they are actually bothered and, they want to fix it because it means something to them. When you start caring and you start actively deciding that you want to make a difference, you can make a difference, right? Talent acquisition is a very layered, there are a multiple set of things that you need to look at when you're hiring people to an organization. There is culture fit, there is how you present. Your communication obviously is something that you look at. The skills that you have, the skills that you need. But does that mean a degree from a certain college? Does that mean top tier institution or whatever it is? Yeah, typically you go to certain institutions because they produce the best minds, but what is best minds? You know what I mean? There are things that you need to challenge in every space, right? Do we need to go to these colleges in order to get the best people, right? Have we tried going to others and have we not met these criteria? Do we need to change the criteria even? Right?
Exactly. That's such a great point, because I was just going to wrap this up with this last question. So in the role that you are right now, talent acquisition, even when you see it from the lens of women's ability, say for example, if I were to talk about the gender group of women, even their abilities, because sometimes, I have faced this.
Sorry, I lost like 30 seconds.
Are you able to hear me? Are you able to hear me?
Sorry, I lost you for about 30 seconds, but you're
right.
back.
So I'll just recap a little bit. So I'm saying that, even in the role, when you, in the role of talent acquisition, when you're talking, say, of hiring women, for example, often, there are a lot of organizations that disregard soft skills.
Yeah.
So there's a certain, education, there's a certain spoken English, or there's a certain way you, or social networking, or there's a certain experience, for example, and in many cases, experience that is unbroken. So for example, when you've taken a break and had to have a child and gone back, so you have to like tediously explain that break in career. Or for example, if you've just taken a year off, to mentally heal or to travel, you have to explain that in terms of what have you learned, what is the experience. So so how we do, when you are hiring and when you're spotting talent, how do you fill these gaps? What are the new things you look at to redefine a person's skill, to sort of make a person, if they have skill in one area, maybe which is not recognized, how do you fill those gaps?
So we are moving to skill-based hiring, right? Which means we literally just look at the skills that you have and how relevant they are to the job that you need to do, right? Sometimes when I talk to candidates, I'm like, please remove married, religion, father's name, date of birth. All these are irrelevant pieces of information to us, right? None of this matters. What you've done and the kind of work that you've done is what matters, right? And I keep insisting that, especially in India, people remove personal information from their profiles because a lot of people do that. Just put that on there. But you know what? There is some organizations. So it's about a skill gap, and how much of the skills you require are you getting? How much is trainable, and how much you need beforehand, right? Obviously, if you decide that if you match 70% of my skill set and the rest of 30% will be taken care of the organization once you get in, because we believe we have that ability to get you there, then that is the kind of model that we are moving to right now, where we are looking at skills and we're not looking so much at all the other aspects of it, right? It is not about what your title was. It is not about what your pedigree is or whatever it is, but literally what skills you bring to the table, right? And how well you can deploy and or showcase these skills. And obviously this is a different method and way of thinking, so it will take time to fully implement and be perfected. But it is a move in the right direction because it takes away, it takes away all those things that were typically considered required to be working in a bank. Yeah, it's privilege also, because I remember when I went for my interview, the first thing that I said to my boss, my current boss, is I said, listen, if you want a fancy MBA, I don't have it, right? So let's get that out of the way. And if you want, we can talk some more. And he's like, oh, dude, thank God. He's like, I thought you were going to spout stuff at me. And I was like, okay, we got that out of the way. And then we talked about work. So there are things that absolutely make no difference in your life, right? Or even as a person that you are when you work. And the skills that you bring as a result of your smarts and your ability and your willingness to apply yourself, that is kind of what is required at the workplace. It is not about the degrees. It is not about anything else. So it is a redefinition and it takes time, but that's where we hopefully will get to soon.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your experiences and your learnings and having this conversation. This is not a one-time conversation. This will go on, and hopefully we'll see great things. And thank you so much for your time, Sri.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye. Have a good evening.
You too.